Good morning, Lee Schlenker from the Business Analytics Institute, and welcome to part 2 of our interview with Nathan Kinch, founder and CEO of Greater Than X. Nathan has been working over the last decade with public and private organizations on the issues of trust, privacy, and ethics. In last week's segment, Nathan defined the notion of data ethics, developed his organization's framework of an ethics operating system, and discussed the specific challenges data scientists, managers, and organizations face today in dealing with the challenges of data ethics. In part 1 of this interview, you offered us quite a bit of food for thought concerning the ethical challenges of AI. Let's begin this morning with your views on surveillance capitalism. One of the paradoxes hidden in this concept is that public and private organizations are using AI to listen to everything that we do, but little of what we have to say. What can be done to give customers, employees, and managers a bigger voice in how corporations and democracies are telling their stories today?
I think that's a really wonderful observation, and it's a great point. You're absolutely right. I'll tell you, I promise I will come back to that, but I'll tell you a really funny story. So Greater Than X's Chief Platform Officer, who is a really wonderful, probably the deepest and most intentional thinker that I've ever had the opportunity to work with. And we just come back from client work up in Brisbane, and he was staying with my family and I on the Gold Coast, and it was about 11:30 at night, and he and I were talking about something very distinct, and it was something that we'd never spoken about, and we've backtracked as far as we can to try and determine if we'd ever spoken about this before, and 10 minutes after we have the conversation, he gets this ping on his phone. That's an email. And it so closely aligned to what we were talking about in terms of categorization. The thing that we were looking for comes through via a LinkedIn message from an individual that just so happens to be offering those products and services. And he hadn't granted LinkedIn access to his microphone. And he certainly hadn't granted LinkedIn access to surveil him in such a way that they could effectively advertise to him as a result of private conversations that he was having. In the most private setting one could really imagine in the physical world at home. And I got the exact same thing at the same time. Now, I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, and for the most part, I think a lot of things that are perceived as conspiracy theories are just troubling based on the status quo, and often we bury our head in the sand, which in the social sciences is referred to as the ostrich effect. But I think that's a really interesting example of organizations that are overextending and listening to the wrong things. They could use the exact same capabilities for social benefit. And our, literally, like, we're banking on this. Our thesis is that the most trustworthy organizations that do actively engage in meaningful discussions with the individuals that they serve, they will be the ones that have the most sustainable sort of competitive advantage. And so just coming back to your question, I thought I'd highlight that because it makes it feel quite personal. We do something called social preferability testing, and I recognize in the social sciences there's a concept of social preference, and social preferability testing basically means to us, how can we determine with reasonable consistency and rigor, depending on a variety of different constraints, that an organization's key stakeholders are truly supportive of what the organization is trying to do, how it's upholding their fundamental rights and freedoms, how it's taking meaningful action if they do screw something up, and how it's supporting those individuals and actively engaging with that organization so that they can craft a shared future that is valuable, meaningful, and engaging together. And I'm super biased because we've sort of doubled down on that approach, and we think that it has real legs. And we are operationalizing that approach, if you will, in lots of different contexts, but specifically throughout our work designing information sharing ecosystems or contributing to the design of information sharing ecosystems like the Consumer Data Right Initiative here in Australia. And we think, and this is super speculative at this point because it's early and we've got a lot of work to do, but we think that approaches like that, that enable an organization to meaningfully interact with its key stakeholder groups, we could potentially use many of the same technologies, many of the same deployments in a way that by design fundamentally respects people's rights and freedoms, but also enables us to sort of like carve out a trajectory that we'd like to go on together. And we can do that based on, you know, quite strong bodies of qual and quant evidence. And so I'm quite optimistic that we have a lot of the ingredients, if you will. If I was a chef and I was in the kitchen and I had I feel like I've got all of the raw ingredients there. And actually, I've got a lot of people that can help me figure out how to use those ingredients to serve up a stunning dish that's tasty, healthy, all these different types of things that we value. And I sort of feel like that's where we are right now in information society. We have a lot of the right ingredients. We just got to figure out how to use them together.
Let's try to bring this conversation home. We've talked previously about the need to provide an explicit link between human values and financial value. This is based on the premise that if we want organizations to effectively act on ethical challenges, we have to be able to tie it to the bottom line. Which points can be used to leverage systems change to help organizations focus on what matters?
That's such a great and such a big question, a challenging question. And I recognize we only managed to just touch on this at the end of our previous call. And so I've been looking forward to diving into it. I think there are some interesting things that are happening around the globe. You know, one example that's very close to home is the New Zealand government has come out and their prime minister is a very smooth operator. But they've sort of come out and proposed that not that they're going to do away with traditional measures of societal progress like gross domestic product necessarily, but that they will prioritize a variety of different wellness determinants. And I think that's huge, because if a nation, if a sovereign state can decide that there are highest order values above and beyond growth, economic growth, I think that says something. That's a stand for something that many of us believe in. And I think that we can absolutely find ways, and we have to figure out how, and there's some great work being done on this, but we have to figure out how to find ways to showcase that enhancing wellness determinants also stimulates other forms of value, whether commercial or otherwise. The other thing that I think in an organizational context is that so often, because of the way that public markets work, and I recognize a challenging question, I'm probably going to kind of traverse and then maybe we'll converge on something that makes sense at the end. The way that public markets work, I think, is reasonably unfortunate because, and this is my experience, and I think there's a lot of analysis that aligns to this. When I work with public organizations, I'm not saying that they lack foresight, they lack vision in all cases, because that would be a very bold and probably problematic statement. I'm not saying that at all. But I think a disproportionate amount of the behaviors that are optimized for in a public markets, corporations context are focused on achieving or surpassing particular sort of metrics or progress indicators that are proposed to be communicated with shareholders. As a result of that, shareholders assign confidence or sort of trust in the unknown that a particular trajectory will continue or increase or whatever, and value is assigned to these organizations. And I think things like Eric Ries's work on the long-term stock exchange are really interesting. And you know, for benefit corporations, B Corps are really interesting because they stand for something quite different. And if we can take a sort of whole of life cycle, whole of customer, whole of ecosystem, depending on how broad you want to go, whole of system viewpoint to the organizations that we're building, although that's challenging and although that's different for most, I think there's an opportunity to find more effective ways over a period of time to associate or even propose sort of causal relationships between the long-term approaches and the kind of long-term value potential that our organization exhibits. So I think that's really big. And then there's another thing that I think is both challenging and at the same time a significant opportunity within an organizational context. And there are probably many, many things outside of the three things that we've discussed, but it's just the fact that when we come into work so often, we put on our work hat. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So quite frequently when we are, say, running a workshop, let's say it's one of our better disclosure workshops where we're using a tool that we developed called the Better Disclosure Canvas. And we're trying to help an organization systematically unpack a customer-facing legal agreement and redesign it so that it meaningfully impacts the way that their customers interact with their brand, and it helps their customers make more informed choices than they've been able to make in the past. So often at the start of the workshop, let's say it's a 6-hour workshop that's taking place co-located, and it's going to be really intense. At the start of the workshop, often people are quite defensive, particularly if they're the individuals who've drafted those agreements in the first place. Understandably so. Even though we recognize that most of these agreements are drafted for other lawyers to protect against class action lawsuits. They're not designed for customers. But they come to the workshop with their work hat on. And as they progress through the day, we often observe these almost like aha moments, as we define them, where it's like the work cap comes off and they start thinking, holy shit, this is relevant to me as a consumer as well. And oh my God, I've got a 15-year-old daughter and she's signing up for products and services all the time. Are these the cumbersome terms that she's entering into? No wonder she exhibits the phenomenon known as the agreement bypass bias. So I think that's actually really important. The more that we can remember, we are people. We rely on our ecology and the ecosystems that we co-inhabit with other species. The work that we do can have a meaningful and potentially even fundamental impact on our lives and the lives of others out there in the world. And remembering that, and even if it's just a 10-second pause, sort of mindfulness break, if you will, before making a decision or taking an action as part of your daily work, I think, and I don't necessarily have a way to quantify this, although, we often have biases towards things that we can count. This is more an observation at this point in time that maybe in a decade we can substantiate more effectively or more thoroughly. I think that's going to have a fundamental impact on the way that organizations operate. It's almost like a grassroots movement of individuals remembering that they're people. And even though they might operate in a challenging organizational context, it's still very possible to act with empathy and consider all of the different things that our actions might have an impact on.
In conclusion, Nathan, and taking into account the different insights and perspectives you've shared, it seems that there is no one perfect equation for matching financial value and human values. This creates an opportunity, if not a necessity, for management to step up to the table to provide an ethical framework for their organizations and markets, if necessary, in reaching out to experts like Nathan Kinch and Greater Than X, to put in place the systems necessary to create an optimal match between human and machine intelligence.
I couldn't have said it better, and I think it's super important. My take, there aren't any easy questions, and as a result of that, there probably aren't easy answers. But if we work together, if we decide this is something that we want to do, we've managed to achieve some pretty incredible things as a species. And I'm pretty confident that we can find ways to make meaningful progress together.
Thank you, Nathan Kinch, founder and CEO of Greater Than X. In part 2 of our interview, we We've discussed what can be done to give customers, employees, and managers a voice in how their corporations are telling their stories today. We've analyzed how systems and processes can be leveraged to help organizations focus on what matters. We've explored the opportunity for management to step up to the table in providing an ethical framework for their employees and their markets. This is Lee Schlenker, Principal of the Business Analytics Institute. Don't hesitate to reach out to us at www.baieurope.com. Take care and talk soon.